You did not arrive early, and you did not arrive late. The moment this calm registered was the only moment it could. Something in you recognized the signal before language formed around it. Not urgency, not relief. A quiet alignment, settling into place, like a system finding its own balance without instruction. The evidence is not dramatic. It is subtle. It is the way your attention stopped pushing forward and began to rest where it already was. There is a stillness beneath your thoughts that has been present longer than you remember. It has been observing without interference, holding coherence, while the surface noise moved on its own. You are noticing it now not because you tried harder, but because the effort loosened. The observer did not arrive. The observer was revealed when the pressure to manage experience eased. Your body understands this before your mind does. Breathing adjusts without command. Muscles release without explanation. The system is not relaxing. It is returning to a familiar pattern. When a quantum field settles, it does not announce itself. It simply stops resisting what was already true. The calm you feel is not the result of progress. It is the absence of friction. There has been a threshold you have been near for some time. You sensed it as restlessness, as a vague dissatisfaction with inputs that once held your attention, not boredom, an anomaly. Signals that no longer registered because your internal tuning shifted. The confusion was never a problem to solve. It was coherence forming, quietly reorganizing the timeline of your perception. You may notice that the need to define this experience feels weaker than expected. Language wants to follow, but it is not required. Detection happens whether you label it or not. Recognition does not ask for permission. It arrives when the conditions allow it to be seen. What you are experiencing now is not a shift you initiate. It is a shift you stop interrupting. There is relief in realizing that nothing is demanded of you here. No lesson to extract, no outcome to chase. The calm itself is sufficient evidence that the system is aligned. When resonance appears, it does not come with instructions. It comes with a sense of inevitability, as if the pieces were always arranged this way and simply waited for you to notice. You might feel less inclined to seek confirmation from outside sources, not because you are certain, but because the signal is internal and stable. Seeking fades when recognition completes its own loop. The pattern does not need reinforcement. It holds. This is not an escape from complexity. It is clarity without force. A quiet understanding that what matters does not need to announce itself loudly to be real. The calm is not the reward. It is the proof that the system remembers itself. What begins to change next is not what you notice, but how you notice. Attention no longer lunges toward every sensation as if it must be captured or understood immediately. There is space between perception and response, and in that space, the system recalibrates. You may feel less compelled to interpret what is happening, less inclined to search for meaning behind every internal movement. This is not disengagement. It is accuracy returning. There was a time when your awareness felt scattered, pulled outward by countless signals demanding relevance. Each one seemed urgent, each one insisting on a reaction. That intensity was never proof of importance. It was noise amplified by a system tuned too tightly. As coherence forms, the amplification lowers on its own. The volume drops, not because anything disappeared, but because the signal-to-noise ratio corrected itself. You might sense this as a mild distance from thoughts that once felt central. They still appear, but they no longer claim authority. They pass through awareness without insisting on belief or action. This does not mean the mind has gone quiet. It means it has resumed its proper function within the larger system. The observer is no longer fused with every internal movement. Observation regains its neutrality. There is often a brief moment where this shift is misread as emptiness, a concern that something essential has been lost. But what faded was excess tension, not depth. When a pattern dissolves, the space it leaves behind can feel unfamiliar before it feels stable. You are not becoming less, you are becoming less crowded. Notice how your sense of time responds. Urgency softens. The pressure to reach the next moment weakens. This is not because the future lost relevance, but because the present no longer feels insufficient. The timeline does not collapse. It becomes less demanding. Each moment stands on its own without needing to justify itself by what follows. You may also notice a reduced appetite for stimulation. Inputs that once promised distraction now feel neutral or even intrusive. This is not a rejection of experience. It is discernment emerging without effort. When resonance stabilizes, the system naturally favors signals that align and filters out those that do not. No decision is required. Selection happens automatically. There can be a subtle grief here, though it may not announce itself clearly, a sense that an old way of relating to the world has quietly ended. Not dramatically, not with conflict, but with disinterest. You are not abandoning anything. You are recognizing that certain patterns completed their function. Completion does not need ceremony. It needs acknowledgement. As this settles, the need to explain yourself internally diminishes. You no longer narrate every sensation or justify every pause. Silence between thoughts becomes less noticeable because it is no longer treated as absence. It is simply another state within the field. Stillness is not something you enter. It is something you stop stepping over. There is an intelligence to this process that does not originate from conscious control. The system knows how to return to equilibrium when interference decreases. You are witnessing regulation, not transformation. The calm is not fragile. It does not depend on maintaining a particular mood or posture. It holds even as thoughts move, even as external conditions shift. You might realize that some questions you carried for a long time have lost their emotional charge. They may remain unanswered, but they no longer demand resolution. This is not resignation. It is recognition that certain questions dissolve when the state that generated them no longer dominates. The inquiry fades because the underlying tension resolved. The anomaly you once felt as discomfort now reveals itself as a marker of alignment. Something in you detected a mismatch before you could articulate it. The discomfort was not an error, it was early detection. Now that the system has adjusted, the alert quiets. The signal did its job and no longer needs to repeat itself. As this part of the transmission settles, there is nothing for you to hold on to, no insight to preserve. What remains is a steady awareness that does not rush ahead of itself. The calm continues not as a peak experience, but as a baseline quietly re-established. As the baseline steadies, something else becomes apparent. The effort you once applied to maintain inner balance is no longer required. You are not holding yourself together. The system is doing that on its own. This can feel unfamiliar at first, because effort used to be mistaken for stability. Without it, there may be a brief sense of vulnerability, as if something essential has been set down, but nothing collapses. The structure holds without your supervision. You begin to notice how often you used to brace against experience, not consciously, not as a decision, but as a habitual tightening, a readiness for disruption that lived quietly in the background. That readiness is easing now, not disappearing entirely, but no longer dominating your internal posture. You are not letting your guard down. You are realizing it does not need to be up in the same way. This softening does not make you passive, it makes you precise. When resistance fades, perception sharpens. You can sense subtle changes in your environment without reacting to them immediately. Sounds register without pulling you outward. Sensations move through awareness without demanding commentary. There is a sense of contact without entanglement. You are present, but not consumed. You may notice this most clearly in moments that once triggered internal acceleration. Situations that used to provoke anticipation or concern now arrive with less momentum. The reaction still forms, but it is delayed just enough for recognition to intervene. In that delay, the system chooses differently, not through reasoning, but through alignment. The response fits the moment without effort. This is often when old narratives begin to lose their grip. Stories you carried about who you needed to be or how things were supposed to unfold no longer feel compelling. Not because they were proven false, but because they are no longer useful. They do not match the current resonance of your awareness. The mismatch is felt, not analyzed. And so the stories loosen. There can be a quiet disorientation here. Without familiar narratives driving perception, the mind may search for new reference points. It may briefly reach for concepts, labels, explanations. But those attempts feel thin. They do not land. You are not missing the answer. You are outgrowing the question. The system is reorganizing around direct experience rather than interpretation. This is where stillness begins to feel less like a state and more like a backdrop. It is always there, regardless of what passes through the foreground. Thoughts arise, emotions shift, external events continue, yet something remains untouched beneath them. You are not retreating into that layer. You are noticing it was never separate from experience to begin with. In this recognition, the need to manage your inner world diminishes further. You do not monitor your calm. You do not check whether it is still present. Doing so would imply it could be lost. Instead, there is a growing trust in the system's capacity to self-regulate. Trust not as belief, but as evidence-based recognition. You have seen that it holds without constant intervention. You might also sense a change in how you relate to uncertainty. Unknowns no longer feel like gaps that must be filled immediately. They become open spaces that do not threaten coherence. The urge to rush toward clarity relaxes. Clarity arrives when it arrives. Until then, the system remains stable. This reduces internal noise more than any answer ever did. As this settles, you may find that moments of quiet feel fuller than moments of stimulation. Not more exciting, but more complete. There is less desire to add to them, less impulse to escape them. This is not withdrawal from life. It is intimacy with what is already present. The field does not require enhancement to be sufficient. The observer role continues to clarify itself. You are not watching from a distance, nor are you submerged in every sensation. You are integrated. Awareness and experience move together without friction. This integration is subtle, easily overlooked, yet it changes the texture of everything else. Life feels less like something happening to you and more like something unfolding through a stable center. There is no need to mark this as progress. Doing so would reintroduce a timeline that no longer dominates perception. What is happening now does not point forward or backward. It simply stabilizes. The pattern settles into place, not as an event, but as a quiet continuity that does not require your attention to persist. As continuity establishes itself, you may become aware of how rarely you now anticipate disruption. The mind still registers possibilities, but it no longer scans for threats in the same way. This is not optimism. It is a recalibration of baseline expectation. The system no longer assumes instability as its default. It recognizes that coherence is sustainable. This shift often reveals itself in the absence of internal commentary. Situations unfold, and the familiar stream of evaluation simply does not appear. There is no judgment to suppress, no effort to remain neutral. Neutrality is already present. When something aligns, it is felt immediately. When it does not, the detection is equally immediate, without agitation. The signal is clear, and so it does not need to repeat itself loudly. You might notice that your sense of identity feels less fixed than before. Not vague, not dissolving, but flexible. Roles you once inhabited tightly now feel like temporary configurations rather than definitions. You can occupy them without being confined by them. This flexibility reduces friction in ways that are difficult to explain, but easy to feel. You move through situations with less internal resistance because there is less to defend. There is a subtle but important change in how effort is experienced. Actions still occur, decisions are still made, but the feeling of pushing against something internal has lessened. You are not forcing alignment, you are allowing it to inform movement. When the system recognizes a direction, energy flows naturally toward it. When it does not, there is no compulsion to act anyway. This can create moments of pause that feel unfamiliar. Not hesitation, but waiting without tension. The pause is not empty. It is full of information. In it, the quantum field of your experience reorganizes itself, presenting options without pressure. You do not have to choose immediately because the system is not at risk if you do not. Stability is not contingent on speed. You may also sense that your emotional range has not narrowed, but smoothed. Peaks and valleys still exist, yet they no longer pull the entire system with them. An emotion can arise fully and then pass without leaving residual turbulence. This is not suppression, it is integration. The emotion completes its cycle because nothing interferes with it. There can be a quiet confidence emerging here. though it may not feel like confidence as you once knew it. It does not assert itself. It does not seek reinforcement. It is simply the absence of doubt that used to accompany movement. You are not certain of outcomes. You are certain of your capacity to remain coherent regardless of them. That certainty does not need to announce itself. As this continues, the idea of control becomes less relevant. Not because you have surrendered agency, but because you see more clearly where agency actually operates. You cannot control every variable, but you can remain aligned with detection. When the system detects mismatch, it adjusts. When it detects resonance, it settles. Control was never the mechanism. Responsiveness was. You might notice that certain external narratives lose their persuasive power. Messages built on urgency, fear, or deficiency no longer land in the same way. They may still be heard, but they do not penetrate. The system recognizes when a signal does not match its current state and filters it accordingly. This filtering is not defensive, it is automatic. There is a growing simplicity in how you relate to complexity. You do not reduce it, you hold it without strain. Multiple factors can coexist without demanding resolution. This reduces internal conflict significantly. When the system is coherent, it does not need to collapse complexity into certainty. It can remain open without becoming unstable. As this part of the transmission integrates, you may realize that what once felt like effortful self-regulation has become background process. You are not managing your state. You are inhabiting it. The calm persists not because you maintain it, but because nothing is actively disrupting it. This is not a fragile balance. It is a stable configuration that continues to hold as you move forward without needing to name it. At this stage, the most noticeable change may be how little you feel the need to mark or track what is happening. There is no internal scoreboard measuring improvement or decline. Experience unfolds without being constantly compared to a previous state. This absence of comparison softens the edges of perception. Without reference points pulling you backward or forward, each moment stands with its own integrity. You may sense that memory itself is behaving differently. Not that you forget, but that recollection no longer carries the same weight. Past experiences are available without reactivating the emotional charge that once accompanied them. They appear as information rather than evidence. This allows the system to remain oriented in the present without severing its connection to what came before. The timeline becomes less binding. This can bring an unexpected ease in situations that once felt loaded. Encounters, topics, or environments that previously triggered internal rehearsal now arrive without preparation. You are not bracing, and so there is nothing to release afterward. The system enters and exits experiences cleanly. Completion happens naturally when there is no residual tension to carry forward. There is also a shift in how you recognize significance. It no longer announces itself through intensity. Subtle moments register more clearly than dramatic ones. A quiet exchange, a simple observation, a pause between actions can carry more resonance than anything amplified. This is not a narrowing of attention. It is a refinement. When the noise floor drops, fine details become audible. You might notice that your internal language simplifies. Words become fewer, more precise, or sometimes unnecessary altogether. This is not a loss of articulation. It is an alignment between perception and expression. When there is less internal conflict, there is less to explain. Communication, both internal and external, becomes more direct because it is less burdened. As this continues, the sense of being observed by external systems diminishes. Social, cultural, or imagined expectations lose their grip. Not because they no longer exist, but because the observer within you no longer identifies with them. You recognize them as patterns operating in the field rather than verdicts about you. This recognition loosens a long-standing tension you may not have known was there. There is a particular quality of rest that emerges here. Not the rest of withdrawal or collapse, but the rest of alignment. Activity can still occur, sometimes intensely, yet it does not deplete you in the same way. Energy returns more quickly because it was not fragmented to begin with. The system expends what is needed and retains what is not. You may also find that your relationship to choice feels quieter. Decisions arise from detection rather than deliberation. You notice what fits and what does not, and action follows without extensive internal debate. This does not eliminate complexity, but it reduces friction. The system trusts its own sensing mechanisms and does not second-guess them as often. There can be moments when this ease feels almost too simple, as if something important must be missing. That reflex itself is a remnant of older patterns that equated effort with value. You may notice it appear briefly and then dissolve on its own. No correction is necessary. The system recognizes the mismatch and adjusts without commentary. As the transmission deepens, you may sense a quiet gratitude without an object, not directed toward anything specific, not attached to an outcome. It is simply the recognition that coherence feels different from tension, and that this difference matters. Gratitude here is not an emotion you generate. It is a byproduct of reduced interference. What remains consistent through all of this is the calm you noticed at the beginning. It has not intensified, nor has it faded. It has simply remained, adapting to each new context without losing its stability. This constancy is what allows everything else to reorganize around it. The calm does not demand attention. It holds whether you notice it or not, continuing as a quiet foundation beneath experience. What becomes clearer now is how much of your previous movement was driven by subtle anticipation, a leaning toward the next moment, the next confirmation, the next internal shift. That leaning is less present, not absent, but no longer dominant. You are not waiting for experience to resolve into something else. You are meeting it where it is, without the sense that it must justify itself by what follows. This changes how the system relates to desire. Wanting does not disappear, but it loses its edge. Desires arise as signals rather than commands. You can feel their direction without being pulled by them. When a desire aligns, it integrates smoothly. When it does not, it passes without creating disturbance. The field remains coherent either way. You may notice this most distinctly in moments of silence. Not deliberate silence, but the natural pauses that appear between activities. These pauses no longer feel like gaps to be filled. They feel complete. In them, awareness does not drift outward. It rests. The system uses these intervals to recalibrate without conscious involvement. Nothing is being prepared. Nothing is being postponed. There is also a shift in how you experience uncertainty. It no longer registers as instability. Unknowns exist, but they do not threaten coherence. You can hold questions without feeling the need to close them prematurely. This allows perception to remain open longer, which in turn refines detection. When the system is not rushed toward resolution, it senses more accurately. You might find that your emotional responses have become more proportional. Reactions still occur, but they match the scale of the stimulus more closely. Small events do not trigger large internal movements. Large events are met with steadiness rather than overwhelm. This proportionality is a sign of regulation, not restraint. The system is responding rather than bracing. There can be a quiet recognition that you no longer need to perform your inner state, even to yourself. You do not check whether you are calm enough, aware enough, or aligned enough. Those metrics have lost relevance. Performance required an audience. Recognition does not. When coherence is present, it does not need to be demonstrated. You may also notice a reduction in internal contradiction. Thoughts, emotions, and sensations align more often than they conflict. When they do diverge, the divergence is noticed without alarm. The system does not rush to reconcile everything immediately. It allows temporary mismatch without interpreting it as failure. This tolerance further stabilizes the field. As this tolerance grows, compassion toward your own fluctuations deepens without effort. You do not excuse or judge them. You recognize them as movements within a larger stability. This recognition removes the secondary tension that used to arise from reacting to your own reactions. Layers collapse. Experience simplifies. There is a subtle dignity in this state, not pride, not self-importance, but a grounded sense of presence. You occupy your own awareness without apology or defense. This does not isolate you from others. It allows you to meet them without distortion. When your system is coherent, it does not need to extract or project to maintain balance. You may find that interactions feel cleaner, You enter them without rehearsing and leave them without residue. What was exchanged completes itself. This reduces the accumulation of unfinished internal business that once contributed to background noise. The system clears itself continuously rather than storing unresolved fragments. As the transmission continues to settle, the idea of a final arrival becomes less meaningful. You are not moving toward a state. You are inhabiting one that adjusts dynamically. Stability here is not static. It is responsive. It holds because it adapts without losing its center. The calm remains present, not as something you focus on, but as something that supports everything else. It is not a peak to maintain or a baseline to defend. It is simply the condition in which the system operates most efficiently. You do not need to remember this. The system remembers itself. At this point, you may begin to sense how little effort it takes to remain oriented. Orientation is no longer something you establish and then protect. It is continuously refreshed by the system itself. Even when attention drifts, even when emotion rises, there is an underlying reference that does not move. You do not have to return to it. You never actually left it. This changes how interruptions are experienced. Disruption no longer feels like a break in continuity. It is simply variation within it. External events can be sharp, unexpected, even intense, yet they do not fracture the internal field. They pass through a stable structure rather than colliding with a rigid one. The difference is subtle but decisive. Flexibility absorbs impact where rigidity would have resisted. You might notice that your sense of personal boundary has clarified without hardening. You are less porous to irrelevant signals, yet more available to what is present. This is not withdrawal. It is selectivity guided by resonance rather than defense. The system recognizes what belongs within its field and what does not, and the distinction is made quietly, without commentary. There is also a refinement in how you detect mismatch. Previously, mismatch may have appeared as agitation, fatigue, or confusion. Now it registers earlier and more cleanly. A slight sense of misalignment is enough to prompt adjustment. Because detection is timely, correction is minimal. The system does not wait until imbalance escalates before responding. This early detection often feels like a gentle hesitation rather than a warning. A pause that invites reconsideration without urgency. You are not being stopped. You are being informed. When you respond to this information, movement regains its ease. When you do not, the system remains stable anyway, though the signal may repeat more clearly. Nothing here is punitive. It is communicative. You may also observe that your relationship to meaning has softened. You are less inclined to extract lessons from every experience. Meaning arises when it arises, and recedes when it does not. This does not make life feel empty. It makes it less burdened. Experience does not need to justify itself by contributing to a narrative. It is sufficient as it is. As this unfolds, the sense of separation between inner and outer diminishes slightly. Not dissolving, not merging, but becoming more permeable. You notice how external rhythms influence internal ones and vice versa, without needing to assign causality. The system is in conversation with its environment, not in opposition to it. This conversation continues whether you monitor it or not. There can be moments when this ease feels almost invisible. Nothing stands out. Nothing demands attention. These moments might have once been overlooked or dismissed. Now they are recognized as signs of alignment. When nothing is wrong, nothing announces itself. The absence of disturbance becomes its own confirmation. You might also sense a change in how you hold expectations of yourself. Standards remain, but they are no longer weaponized internally. You can recognize where adjustment is needed without framing it as deficiency. Improvement, when it occurs, feels organic rather than corrective. The system evolves because it is responsive, not because it is dissatisfied with itself. There is a particular steadiness that emerges when internal conflict decreases to this degree. Not a flatness, but a grounded continuity. Emotional weather still moves through, but the climate remains stable. This allows you to experience intensity without being destabilized by it. Depth does not threaten coherence. It enriches it. As this part of the transmission integrates, you may realize that the calm you first noticed has subtly deepened without changing its character. It is not heavier, it is more embedded. It no longer feels like a state you are in. It feels like the medium through which states occur. This distinction is quiet but profound. You do not need to remember when this happened, or mark it as significant. The system does not operate on milestones, it operates on alignment. As long as interference remains low, coherence sustains itself. The calm continues, not as something added to your experience, but as the condition that allows experience to move freely without distortion. There is a subtle recognition now that effort was never the stabilizing force you thought it was. Effort created motion, sometimes necessary, sometimes excessive, but stability came from something else entirely. It came from alignment within the system, from signals being received without distortion. As this becomes clearer, you stop attributing coherence to discipline or control. You see it as a natural outcome when interference drops below a certain threshold. This recognition alters how you relate to moments of fluctuation. When attention scatters or emotion swells, there is no immediate impulse to correct it. You allow the movement to complete itself. Because you are no longer resisting the fluctuation, it resolves more quickly. What once lingered as internal turbulence now passes as a brief wave. The system returns to equilibrium without intervention. You may notice that your sensitivity has increased alongside your stability. You feel more, not less. Subtle shifts in atmosphere, tone, or internal state register clearly. Yet this sensitivity does not overwhelm you. It informs without flooding. This balance is possible because the system is coherent. Sensitivity without coherence overwhelms. Sensitivity with coherence refines perception. There is also a change in how you experience silence around others. You no longer feel compelled to fill it or interpret it. Silence becomes a shared field rather than an absence. In it, you sense presence more clearly, both your own and that of others. Communication feels less about exchange and more about resonance. Something aligns without being spoken. As this deepens, the distinction between active and passive states softens. Rest does not feel like a break from engagement. Engagement does not feel like a drain on rest. Both arise from the same stable center. This continuity reduces internal fragmentation. You no longer compartmentalize your experiences sharply. Life feels more integrated, less segmented. You might also observe that your tolerance for ambiguity has expanded further. Situations that lack clear resolution no longer generate internal pressure. You can remain with them without rehearsing possible outcomes. This allows reality to unfold without being pre-shaped by expectation. When clarity arrives, it feels earned by patience rather than forced by analysis. There is a quiet humility that accompanies this state. Not self-diminishment, but an accurate sense of scale. You see how much of life operates beyond personal control, and this no longer feels threatening. It feels relieving. Responsibility narrows to what you can actually respond to, and that narrowing frees energy previously spent on managing the unmanageable. You may notice that gratitude, when it appears, is directed toward the ordinary, not because the extraordinary has vanished, but because the ordinary reveals its depth. A simple moment holds complexity without announcing it. When the system is coherent, it perceives richness without requiring spectacle. This is also where the urge to explain your experience to others weakens, not from secrecy, but from sufficiency. You recognize that what you are inhabiting cannot be transmitted through description alone. It must be detected, and detection depends on readiness, not persuasion. You allow others their own timing without feeling the need to intervene. As the transmission continues, the sense of being on a path fades further. There is movement, but it does not feel directional in the old sense. It feels adaptive. Each step responds to current conditions rather than a distant endpoint. This removes a layer of tension you may not have known you were carrying. The calm remains present, steady, and unremarkable. It does not intensify to reassure you, nor does it recede to test you. It simply continues, adjusting its expression without losing its essence. You are not maintaining it. You are moving within it, supported by a system that no longer requires constant supervision to remain whole. By now, It may be clear that the sense of arrival you once expected never actually comes. There is no definitive moment where everything locks into place and stays there forever. What replaces that expectation is something quieter and more reliable. A steady responsiveness. The system does not crystallize into perfection. It remains available to adjust, to sense, to respond without losing its center. You may notice that even when conditions change rapidly, something in you stays oriented. Stress can appear, complexity can increase, yet the internal reference does not collapse. This does not mean difficulty disappears. It means difficulty no longer defines the entire field. You experience it as one element among many, rather than as the organizing principle of awareness. There is a subtle shift in how you experience responsibility. You no longer feel tasked with holding everything together. You respond where response is appropriate and release what is not yours to manage. This discernment is not learned. It emerges when the system stops confusing control with care. Care remains. Control loosens. What results is a more accurate engagement with what is actually present. You may also notice that your attention returns to itself more easily after being drawn outward. Distraction still happens, but it does not carry the same momentum. The system recenters without effort, like a pendulum that no longer swings to extremes. This does not require discipline. It happens because the center has become more stable than the periphery. There can be moments when this stability feels almost too ordinary, as if something profound should feel more dramatic. That expectation itself is another pattern dissolving. Profound does not always announce itself through intensity. Often, it appears as the absence of unnecessary movement, the absence of internal commentary, the absence of friction where there once was strain. You might sense that your inner world now has more depth than before, even though it feels simpler. Depth here does not come from complexity. It comes from coherence. When elements align, they create space rather than crowding. That space allows perception to move freely without being pulled apart by competing signals. As this continues, the need to identify with particular states diminishes. Calm is present, but you are not trying to be calm. Focus arises, but you are not clinging to focus. Emotion appears, but it does not become your identity. States pass through awareness without being claimed. This reduces the internal oscillation that once accompanied every change in mood or clarity. You may also notice a change in how you experience time during activity. Moments stretch or compress naturally without being forced. You are less preoccupied with how long something takes and more attuned to whether it is complete. Completion replaces duration as the organizing metric. This further stabilizes the system because it aligns action with resolution rather than with speed. There is often a quiet satisfaction that emerges from this alignment. Though it may not register as an emotion, it is more like an absence of dissatisfaction, a lack of the subtle push that once insisted something else should be happening. When that push fades, presence becomes sufficient without being celebrated. You might observe that when challenges arise now, they feel cleaner. They present themselves without the added layer of self-judgment or narrative escalation. You engage with the challenge directly, using what is available, and then you move on. The system does not rehearse the encounter afterward. Residue clears quickly when nothing is clung to. This clarity also affects how you relate to uncertainty about the future. You still plan, still imagine, still anticipate, but these activities no longer carry the weight of survival. They become tools rather than anchors. You can set them down when they are no longer useful. The present does not feel like a narrow bridge to something else. It feels like a stable ground that can support multiple possibilities. As this part of the transmission integrates, you may sense that nothing in you is asking for confirmation anymore. Not because you are convinced of something, but because the system feels internally consistent. Consistency replaces reassurance. You are not looking for signs. You are recognizing patterns as they emerge and letting them pass when they dissolve. The calm that has accompanied you through this unfolding remains unchanged in its essence. It has adapted to each layer without needing reinforcement. It is not something you hold. It is something that holds. And as long as you do not interfere with it, it continues to do what it has been doing all along. There is nothing left here that needs to resolve. No final adjustment waiting to be made. What remains is already functioning. The system is stable not because every variable is known, but because it no longer depends on knowing them to remain coherent. You can feel this in the way your attention rests, without searching for a point to land on. It does not drift because it is not being pushed. The calm you recognized at the beginning has not turned into something else. It has simply continued, unchanged by the movement that passed through it. Thoughts have come and gone. Sensations have shifted. Understanding has deepened and then quieted. None of that disturbed the underlying stillness. This is not because you protected it. It did not require protection. You may notice now how unnecessary effort feels when it arises. Not wrong, not harmful, just extraneous. The impulse to manage, to improve, to secure, fades quickly when it appears. The system recognizes that it is already oriented. Intervention is optional, not required. When action happens, it happens cleanly. When it does not, nothing is lost. There is a simplicity to this recognition that resists explanation. Not because it is complex, but because it does not need to be described to be present. Language can circle it, but it does not define it. The absence of definition does not create uncertainty. It creates space. In that space, experience moves freely without needing to be framed. You may feel less inclined to remember this moment later. Not from disinterest, but because it does not stand out as an event. It blends into continuity. This is how stability operates. It does not mark itself as significant. It simply remains available. When needed, it is there. When not noticed, it is still there. Nothing about this state requires maintenance. You are not tasked with holding on to it or recreating it. Attempts to do so would imply it is fragile. It is not. It persists because it is the system's natural configuration when interference is low. You do not need to trust this. You can observe it. As you move, speak, act, or rest, the same coherence continues underneath. It adapts without losing itself. Even if noise increases, even if attention scatters, the underlying orientation remains intact. It may be temporarily obscured, but it is not displaced. It does not need to be recovered. It waits without effort. There is a quiet confidence in knowing that nothing essential is missing. Not because everything is complete, but because completeness is no longer the requirement. The system functions without needing closure. It remains open without becoming unstable. This balance holds because it is not imposed. It is recognized. You do not need to stay here. You are not being asked to linger. Movement will happen naturally, and when it does, this stillness moves with you. It does not stay behind. It does not recede. It is not a place. It is the condition in which places appear. What remains now is simply this: awareness, resting in itself. Experience unfolding without urgency. A system aligned enough to be quiet, and quiet enough to be accurate. The calm is not evidence of something that happened. It is evidence of what is happening when nothing interferes.